Supercharge your project management skills with an AI sidekick. Learn game-changing prompt engineering techniques to track tasks, predict risks, and strategize better solutions. Deliver top-notch projects on time and under budget by gaining a mental exoskeleton to see deeper into your projects and interact with stakeholders. Become a project management superhero with fundamental prompt engineering skills to deliver incredible value within any constraints.
We're going to start our journey of generative AI and project management by looking at 3 fundamental primitive operations that we can use generative AI for that will help us in all of our project management activities. Now, we're going to start off by looking at them when we're kicking off a project. During the initialization phase for a project, we're going to go and look at what these 3 fundamental operations are. Now, I want to show you what they are and kind of give you a visual, and then later we're going to go and look at the prompt engineering behind these. Let's assume that we have some big task, some big thing that we're trying to accomplish, and I'm just going to call this PRJ or project. Now, what we would like to know is we would like to be able to decompose this project into all kinds of things. We might want to go and break it down into tasks that we have to perform. We might need to go and break it down into resources that we're going to need. We might need to go and analyze it and break it down into staff or phases or whatever it is, but we're going to take this big thing and we're going to decompose it or break it down. And we're going to be doing this all the time throughout the project. Now, what we'd like to be able to do is automate some aspect of that. Now, the goal of the automation isn't to replace our own reasoning or critical thinking. The goal is to help inform it. Now, the analogy I give for this is like, let's imagine that you're trying to think about how to paint something. And you go into a museum and you look at lots and different ways to paint it. You see lots of different paintings on the wall. The goal is not to copy into individual paintings. Sometimes, people will go and do that to learn about the style of that person, to learn something from doing that. But that's not what we're going to be doing here. Our goal is to inform us so we can see all of the different ways that we might go and basically approach that particular task. What's common, what's variable, and help inspire and improve our own thinking. What we can do with generative AI, and that it's very, very good, is it's very good at decomposing things. So whenever we have Gen AI, like we do here, we can go and we can feed in things, whatever they are. So let's assume that we have a square, we can feed this in, and it's very good at breaking it down into its individual pieces. So one of the fundamental things that we can do with generative AI is decomposition. That is, we take some larger whole and we break it down into pieces. Now, one of the things we can do is we can break it down into pieces in all kinds of different ways. For example, we can say break it down into these types of pieces. So we might say break it down into tasks. We might say break it down into phases. We can take the generative AI and we can use it to decompose something in many different ways so that we can get its individual parts. Now, once we have created and broken something down into its individual parts, then one of the important things that we can do with generative AI is we can begin organizing those pieces. So let's imagine, and I'm going to stop using Gen AI and I'm going to start using LLM because it's much easier to write. So an LLM is a large language model, something that we are using for the generative AI. So examples of large language models are ChatGPT, Claude. These are all large language models. So these are the things we put our prompt into that goes and performs the work. So we can feed our tasks and things into the large language model and have it go and break them down into individual, let's say, subtasks. But what if we want to know dependencies between them and we want to organize them so that things that have lots of dependencies on them come earlier in the project plan? So we can tell it, for example, let's say these are our tasks and we have some different, identifiers of these things. We can say, now go and organize them so that the things that everything else depends on come first. And it might say, well, the star is the really important one that needs to come first. And so it puts that first in the plan. And then it goes and says, well, this thing with this kind of square thing goes next. And then maybe we have this thing over here. And so one of the fundamental capabilities of large language models is to take these individual pieces that we break something down. So when we apply this decomposition operator, we're going to get a bunch of parts. Those parts might be tasks. They might be phases. They might be roles of stakeholders, whatever it is, because we can go and have it take something and break it down into parts. once we have the parts, we have to think about how to organize them. And if you think about it, this is what we do when we are performing project management, is we have to go and take some really complex thing and break it down into pieces. So we can use the large language model to break it down, and then we can do what we also do, which is we can go and take those individual pieces and we can think about how to organize them. How do we structure it so that we can keep track of it all effectively, but also so that we can communicate it to other people, so that we can reason about risks, so that we can find gaps. All of these things are why we might want to go and organize the individual components. So we can decompose, and then once we get those pieces, we can go and organize them. Two very, very fundamental and important tasks that we can perform, or operations that we can perform. Now, one of the other things we can do once we get those pieces, and particularly when we get organizations of those pieces, is we can start going and doing analysis. So we take our project plan, or we take our project, we decompose it into a series of tasks. We then organize those tasks to have a schedule behind them, so that we're going to have some ordering, and then we could go and analyze the schedule for risk. And we could say which tasks, if they are late, are going to have the biggest impact on the schedule. So we can imagine we take in our initial thing, we feed it into the LLM, and we then get a bunch of individual pieces out of this LLM. We take these and we have the LLM organize them again for us. And we get out of that some type of organization or schedule, let's say, for those pieces. And then we can take this again and we can feed it into the LLM, and we can get analyses that might be useful to us, like risk. And we might see what are problems that we may have, what are ambiguities in our plan, what are gaps, all of these types of things. And so we're going to look at all the different things we can do. We're going to start in the initialization phase of the project, where we're really getting it started, where we're doing the initial planning. We're trying to understand how we're going to go about and tackle these different challenges. And we're going to look at these three key things. One is the ability to decompose. So how do we break something down into its individual pieces? Two, how do we organize them? So how do we use the LLM to help us in this process? And then three, once we've organized them, how do we analyze them? So that we can go and better think through the decisions that we're going to make, better through the organization, the structures, all of these different issues. Now, the goal of this, and I want to take you back to that museum analogy. The goal of this is not for you to walk into the museum, see one painting on the wall that the large language model produces, and to copy it. That is not the goal of this. And if you were doing that, like, what's your point? What's your role? That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is be able to use these operations to go and explore and understand things from different perspectives, to see lots of different options for how this project could be painted, lots of different styles for how we might go and break it down into tasks, lots of different ways we might organize them based on different goals or different risks that we're trying to mitigate. And so really what we're trying to do is use the tool to enhance our capabilities, not to replace them. So throughout this, what we're building is the fundamental operations that you can go and use to perform these different important parts of project management. But you should be thinking about how do you use them to improve what you do. So rather than go and break it down one time, one way, have it break it down multiple times for you in multiple different ways so that you can analyze them and you can think about them, because you're the brains behind this. You want to think about all these different options for how you might go about it, and then you think critically about how to take the many different options you've seen from the large language model and choose for them. You go and take those tasks after you've decided the way you want to break it down and look at different organizations, have it help you organize them in different ways, and then take it and do the final organization yourself once you've decided what you really want. But your goal is to explore more, to get a more thorough breakdown and analysis, because this planning phase, the goal is not to get it done faster. The goal is to get it right. Because if we don't get it right, everything else could fall apart. So our goal is not to just get there faster. Our goal is to get to a better answer, to get to a better plan, to decompose many different ways and consider all of them and use our critical thinking to see what's best, to organize many different ways and do it rapidly, and then organize them and understand what's the best one. And then to analyze all of these organizations of tasks from many different perspectives, and then to select the one that has whatever the best outcome it is based on the analysis that we've done. The goal is not to automate this. The goal is not to just plan faster. The goal is to plan better, to organize better, to break down better, because if we don't get it right at the beginning, we're going to be in huge amount of trouble. Getting there faster is not going to help us down the road if we get to the wrong answer or we get to a subpar answer. Let's look at the very first operation, and this is going to be one of the most powerful operations at our disposal when we're using generative AI in planning. And that is the ability to decompose things into their constituent pieces. So we're going to take a project and we're going to break it down into phases. We're going to take a project, we're going to break it down into tasks. Whatever it is, it's that ability to take something and analyze it and figure out how to break it down into its pieces. And then once we have those pieces, we can go and organize them, we can analyze them. But before we get there, we want to start off with that most basic fundamental thing of how do we take this really complex thing and simplify it by breaking it down into individual parts that we can go and tackle individually or reason about individually or help to allocate to people to go and perform. And so that's going to be an important initial thing we're going to go and look at. So let's get started. Now I want you to imagine you've just had your project kickoff meeting. And what I've got here is I've got a transcript that was recorded of that initial meeting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the large language model to go and decompose the raw transcript of this meeting into a series of tasks that'll be needed for this project. Now, this seems like science fiction, and I know every time I do this, I'm so amazed. In fact, one of my favorite things to do is to start from raw, Zoom or Microsoft Teams transcripts, because it really immediately shows me the value. People talk all the time about summarizing the meeting transcripts. I don't know why you would summarize it, because then as a human, you have to go and read through the thing and actually get the important stuff out. What I want to do is take that raw transcript and immediately break it down directly into the parts that I need and that I need to start reasoning and organizing. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, here's the meeting transcript. This is just a raw Zoom recording, a VTT file that I've uploaded as a document. I want you to act as a project manager. Now I'm going to come back to this later. This is the persona pattern at work, and we'll talk about this later. When we want to start thinking about subject matter experts or how we guide the reasoning, this is going to be important. But for now, I just want you to hang with me on this piece. I want you to act as a project manager. Given the transcript from the kickoff call, break down the project into a list of tasks. This is the decomposition. Each task should include a brief description, its dependencies, and the estimated time to complete. And I've given it the raw Zoom transcript for this meeting that took place. Now, one of the beautiful things, we can talk about it later, is that transcripts also have people involved and who's saying what, depending on how you record it, of course. And what does it say? Well, it starts breaking down that transcript and that project that's described into a series of tasks, basically project overview and planning, development phase preparation. Project overview and planning, finalize the project goals, objectives, and timelines based on the initial discussion, ensure all team members are aligned, dependencies, input from all team members on their specific areas, estimated time, 1 week. Now, we'll talk about how to make these things more accurate to your timelines, what it actually takes in your organization. But start right now, we're just going to look at the decomposition and how to initially do it, a rough decomposition. Now, I want to take you through this prompt in detail to show you what's happening. We're going to see similar patterns in the prompts that we use throughout this course. The first thing that we're doing that we're almost always going to do is we're going to give it some type of input. That is, we're not going to go and use the large language model like it's internet search. We're not going to just go in and say, hey, give me the phases of my project, because it doesn't know about your project. You have to tell it. And the way we tell it is we give it input. Now, in this case, what I did was I uploaded a file that was the transcript of a meeting. I could also go and I could start with a project plan in a Word document, or a description of our mission and what we're trying to achieve and the product or the vision, whatever it is. You can have multiple documents, you can have one document, you can have a meeting transcript, You can have a bunch of rough notes that was taken in that meeting because nobody recorded it. Whatever it is, you have total flexibility, and you don't need to worry too much about the formatting of that. And I typically don't worry at all about the format of it. But the goal is you need to give it information. You don't want to go and pretend that it knows something about your project when it doesn't. So it has to have some input, some starting point of, learning about your project, learning about the current state of it in order to break it down into pieces. So that input is, in this case, a raw transcript from a Zoom call. The second piece is, in our prompt, we're going to give it an operation to perform. Now, we talked about those 3 operations that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to talk about decomposing things or decomposition. We're going to talk about organization, and we're going to talk about analysis. Now, so this is where we're going to go and specify that operation. So we're saying the operation is decompose. I want you to decompose this thing. And the way that we express that to the LLM is it could be decompose, but I don't typically use decompose. So I'm just saying break down the project. That's another way of telling the LLM or the generative AI that you want to break this thing or decompose it into parts. Now, what we have to do is we have to tell it what type of parts we want to decompose into. So we say break down the project into a list of tasks. So this is critical. We can break it down in many different ways. We could say break it down into phases. We could say break it down into goals. We could say break it down into tasks like we are here. So not only are we going to specify the operation, but we're going to specify what is the output that we want. That is a list of tasks. And then very importantly, we are going to specify the requirements for that output. That is, we're telling it, I want you to perform this decompose operation on this input which I gave you, which is the project kickoff meeting transcript. And here are the requirements for your output. I want each task to include a brief description, its dependencies, and the estimated time to complete. And this is just like if you went and you gave a team member, you tasked them, and you said, you go and complete this task, and the result of that task must meet these requirements. If you're building software, you'll say the software must meet these requirements. That feature must meet these requirements. And you're doing the same thing with the large language model. You're going and telling it, take this input, perform this operation, and your output has to meet these requirements. So this is where you take control and you're basically hiring it, telling it what you want it to do for you. And then what we see is the output from the LLM. We've got a project overview and planning, development phase and preparation. As we stated, each one has estimated time to complete. So you see up here, we said brief description, estimated time to complete, and dependencies. And we're getting down here, brief description, dependencies, estimated time to complete. So our requirements are driving the output that it's giving us. And it goes through and it breaks it down into all the constituent pieces. You notice we were getting a detailed sort of outline of tasks that need to be performed. And now we have this raw material, a Zoom transcript broken down into a list of tasks. Now, is this what we do? Do we stop as the people that are organizing this, planning this, and say, great, it's done? No, of course not. The large language model doesn't know enough about your project probably from that transcript to do a perfect job. It doesn't have information and insight that you have on all of the different stakeholders, what's important goal-wise. It doesn't know all of those things. You do. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this and you're going to use this as draft input. The goal is not to take it and use it as the result. The goal is to use it as some initial starting point for what you're going to do, or even better, as a way to go and explore different ways that we could decompose. So what we can see sometimes is that if we come up with the right decomposition, the right constituent pieces, the problem becomes easier to tackle. But figuring out what those pieces are and how to structure them and organize them and communicate them can be the really hard part. And so one of the things that can help us is to basically go and decompose the task multiple different ways, see different options, and then use that to inform our thinking. And we as the human beings are going to make the final call on what is the right decomposition. So how do we do this with the large language model? Well, one way we could go and say, give us 5 different options for decomposing it. But the problem with that often with particularly like something like a project management plan is there's only so much that the large language model can give us at once. And we're going to see this over and over, is that when we're outputting things, it can only give us a certain amount of text. So if we ask it for too much at once, it can't give it to us all. And the more sort of broad the task is, that it's, the bigger the thing is that we're asking it to decompose, the more space it's going to need to decompose it to a really fine-grained level. So what we're going to see is that when we ask it to take some really big problem and decompose it, there's a limit to how granular it can be when it decomposes it. If it's too fine-grained, there's just going to be too much stuff for it to fit it into its answer. So we'll see how we deal with this in a minute. But the other thing we're going to see is that if we go and ask it for 5 different ways of decomposing it all at once, it's not going to be able to do a very good job doing all 5 at once. It's only going to give us a very high level for each one of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to see a way that we can go and ask it many different times to decompose in different ways. And the simplest way to do that is we just go and rerun the original prompt. Every single time that you give it exactly the same input and exactly the same prompt, you can get a completely different answer. So I didn't change this at all. I just gave it that original transcript from that meeting. I gave it exactly the same prompt, and it came back with a different decomposition, a different set of tasks. And that's a special superpower you now have, is you can go in and with absolutely no effort, you can go and quickly look at 5, 10, 3, however many you want, decompositions of that thing into tasks, phases, whatever it is you want. You can rapidly go and explore different ways of doing it, and it can help inform your thinking about what's the right way to decompose it. Because again, if we can get the right decomposition, it can make a lot of things easier later. So if we can begin seeing different ways of doing it, we can pick and choose what are the best approaches, or maybe we fuse 2 of them together. So this is what it gave us this time, and this is what it gave us originally. You see there's different. There's some commonality to them, but there's some difference as well. And that's something that's beautiful for us, because now we have a diversity of options. We can go and look, and in fact, we can tell it decompose it in a very different way. Here's what you gave me last time. I want you to give me some totally different way of doing it. Now, part of the reason we're doing this is we are going to go and give it to us. It's like walking into the museum. Every time we tell it to generate a new one, we're getting a new option in that museum. Now, we could do it in the same conversation. We could just follow up and say, give me another decomposition. That's fair game. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to start a totally different conversation and say, give me a decomposition of this. So you can either do it in the current conversation, or you can start a new conversation and do it there. And you may want to experiment and see which one works best for your particular needs. But the key thing is generation. Getting it to generate some text is really, really cheap. So we want to generate lots of options for whatever it is we're trying to do. Now, I showed you an example where I attached the meeting transcript as a file to the prompt. Now, what if you either are working in an environment where you don't have the ability to attach files, or you just don't have a file? Well, another way you can do this is in the prompt itself. You don't have to attach a file. You can do something like this, where you give it information in the prompt. So I say project overview : and then I have these dashes, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second. And then I say this project will build a new website to deliver content to our users with AI, and I have some dots, ellipses. And this is where you could go in and just write whatever notes, free form, express your ideas about the project and what it's supposed to do, write anything you want in there. And then I say, I want you to act as a project manager, given the transcript, and I have the original prompt. So all I'm doing is taking the original prompt, but now I'm adding to it information about the project to go and use for its decomposition. So you can attach it as a file, a document, a series of documents, or you can just go and modify the prompt really simply and start writing in information in it, or copying and pasting in information in it. Any of those ways will work. If you don't have access to the ability to upload files, you can do it this way. Now, if you do it this way, those dashes can be very important, because what you want to do is clearly indicate this is the information you're working with, not what I'm telling you to do. So for example, if you have like a project plan, it might have step 1, go and do this. Step 2, write a blog post about this. And you don't want the large language model to read that and literally respond to it as like, okay, I'm going to start writing a blog post. No, you want it to see that step one is one of the tasks that it's going to decompose out of that, not to perform step one. And so the way that you help make sure that the large language model doesn't react to the content itself is by putting these like dashes or some type of visual, clear visual separator to show you this is the information you're working with, but not things that you should do. Very important distinction. Then we put that in and we go and we get, again, a decomposition. Now, we can use any of these techniques or any combination of them. We can upload a document initially, or we might go in and feed it information just like we just did. We may decompose many different ways. We can go in and say, I want to decompose it into tasks. I want to decompose it into phases. And we can also go and we can take that same thing. We can decompose into tasks multiple times. And each time we decompose, we will get a different, sort of perspective on what the task could be. And our goal is to go and explore. Let's look at very rapidly. Let's prototype. You can think of this as rapid prototyping. You're rapid prototyping what the tasks might be. Now, normally it's so hard for us and it takes so much work to do the decomposition in the first place, manually, that we probably don't explore as much as we should. And this can create issues later. So what we want to do is we want to rapidly prototype different decompositions, see different ways that we could decompose the project, use that to inform our own human thinking, critical thinking, and judgment, and then write out or select or merge or whatever we do, the actual final one that is coming from us, not from the LLM directly. That is, it's our job to be the manager of that, the editor, the curator, the creative critical thinker. The other thing is, when you are taking in many different inputs, you're using your own aesthetics, your own critical thinking to merge them together, you're doing something that the LLM cannot do and helping make sure that you have a strong place in the future. You don't want to get to a place where you're just accepting its output and copying it, paste into the plan. You want to be critically thinking and analyzing it and using it to arrive at something that it couldn't arrive at its own, that another human being couldn't arrive at on their own, because you're going to go and do an even better analysis than can ever be done before. Now, one of the things that I mentioned that we're always going to be dealing with the large language model is it can only do so much work for us at a time. Now, what this is called is basically the number of output tokens that it can produce at once. Now, what is a token? Does this matter? For your, sort of key, knowledge, you don't have to know exactly what a token is, but what you need to know is that it can only produce a certain amount of text at once. That's what I want you to think about. It's like, imagine that you've given one of your, people in your team, you've given them a task, and they can never write more than like a page and a half. No matter what you ask them to do, all they can do is write 1.5 pages max. And in fact, they like to write about a page to, 3/4 of a page. That's like the sweet spot for that team member. And that's the way the large language model works, is it's like got a sweet spot of about a 3/4 page, maybe a page of text at once. So if you give it something to do and it doesn't fit into 3/4 of a page or a page, what you're going to see is it either stops and cuts off its answer in the middle, or it gives you a higher level of detail. Like it doesn't give you enough detail about what you want, right? So if you ask some question or ask for some plan and you want really fine details, that's not going to fit in a page or 3/4 a page. So what you're going to see is more of a summarized plan. And so what we're going to have to do is figure out, how do we go and build things and work on things where all we can get is 3/4 of a page or like a page at a time? So I want you to think about it this way. What we're going to do initially is we're going to take in and we're going to decompose something. So we have this plan, project, whatever it is that we're going to decompose. And what we're going to get out is a bunch of parts, right? So the large language model is going to go and produce a bunch of pieces. These might be tasks. These might be phases. They could be any individual thing that, we care about and we want it to give us. And so what do we do when we want it to break down, like really what we don't want like 3 tasks, we want like 100. We want like extreme detail because we want a really, really detailed plan. How do we get there if all that will fit into a page is 3? Well, what we do is we go and we take one of these and then we feed it to the large language model and have it break that thing down into additional pieces. And then if we have one of those that we want to break down, we go and we break it down further. And the idea is that we're iteratively going through, and at each level, we can break something down into finer and finer levels of granularity so that we can get more and more detail. So up here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting off at a high level. And then as we go down in this journey, every time we get something new, we're going to get greater and greater detail in it. And so that decomposition operation, what we're going to do is we're going to apply it over and over. We're going to decompose, we're going to get a bunch of pieces, we're going to take one of those pieces and we're going to decompose it further. And then we may be happy and we may go back to the next level up and we may decompose one of those tasks into subtasks, and then we may go take another one of them and decompose them into subtasks. And we may decide that one of those subtasks needs additional detail and we decompose it. So we're going to be decomposing over and over into different pieces. Now, what does this look like in prompts? So I want to take you back to that very first decomposition of the project into tasks. It gave me this very sort of broad, high-level overview of what the tasks could be, like project overview and planning, development phase preparation. What if we want to really dive deeper on project overview and planning? Like, I don't want just this high-level task that's 1 week, but I want to actually plan that week out in more detail. I want to get down to like the hourly level of what's going to have to happen and all of the subtasks underneath that week. How do I do that? Well, the way I do that is I take that task that it broke it down into, and I can literally copy and paste it. So I may have documented this already, put it into a document. I may have put it into some project planning tool. In this case, let's just imagine I've got the text still in the LLM. I'm going to copy that text and I'm going to move it into a prompt. And I'm going to move it into a prompt that basically uses that model that I showed you before, where you can basically directly specify the information in the prompt. And I'm going to say, break this task down into subtasks with estimated time per task. And I have a typo, apologies. So with estimated time per task. And what I'm doing is I'm taking that initial part and I'm now breaking it down further. And what we see is it goes and it looks at that task now, and it breaks it down into a bunch of additional individual tasks. So we've seen that it can go and we can take one of its original tasks that it created and it can break down its own tasks as well. So what we've done is we've gone and we've taken something that's high level and we've made it more fine-grained. We've got detail for that original task. So if you look at this now, we've got tasks that are sort of measured in hours as opposed to in a whole week. And so these are all tasks that would be subtasks on the one above. And so we can go through and begin navigating down. Now, if we take one of these subtasks, let's say, and we want to refine it further and get its subtasks, so the subtasks, we take one of them for, let's imagine, the defined project goals and objectives. We want to get more detail on this. We want to break it down further. We take it, we put it into the prompt. Again, this is the part that we're now adding. So it's one of the parts that it created. We're now adding it into the prompt, and then we run it, and we see it now has been broken down into its own constituent pieces as well. Now, this is really important. We can do this as many times as we want. We can go and take one of the things that it produces. If we remember, that was something that it produced earlier, and I can go and take that thing that it produced and I can tell it break it down more. Now, the reason we can't do this all at once is because if you look at all of this, it doesn't fit into a page anymore. And the moment things don't fit into a page, I want you to think about like how you would go and draft an outline. So if you had a really complex report that's going to be hundreds of pages of long, what you might do is you might start off with a high level 1 outline. And then underneath each of those headings, you would go and break it down into additional items, subheadings are underneath that heading. And then you might write each of those subheadings. And maybe each of those subheadings then fits into a page. And then you would go back and you pick the next top level heading. You'd break it down into subheadings. And then you write each of those subheadings, and each one is a page. And in fact, if you need to write a report that's really, really long for your project, you can use this exact method to begin tackling that report in parts and going and basically writing it, a page at a time, but still getting it to fit together into this overall structure. But that's what we're going to be doing, is you want to think in terms of outlines, or think in terms of tasks and subtasks and sub-subtasks. Something where you're breaking it apart. And at the top level of organization is the sort of highest level of organization. It's the most summarized. And down at the bottom is the finest level of detail. But that fine level of detail, you can't do it all at once because you can't get it all into one page. Just like if you said, go and write this report that's 100 sections and it can only write a page at a time, what you're going to get is it might not even be able to, output all of the outline. And so that's why we're doing this. One piece at a time, we get some output, some tasks, some phases, whatever it is, and then we go and take those individual things that it produces and we take each one of them and break it down further. And we do it iteratively, one at a time. Fundamental thing that we can do with the large language model is we can do this decomposition, we can do it iteratively, and we can break down to a particular level. We can decide we want to go further. We can take one of those tasks, we can take all of them, we can break them further, we can take a phase, we can break all the phases down into further phases. We can take one phase and break it down further. We get to choose where we add detail. And each time we want to add detail, we're typically going to be adding a new prompt. And we can do this by simply cutting and pasting information that needs into the prompt, separating it with some type of separator like these dashes. We can put it before the instructions, so like we did that initially. We said, here's some notes on the project. Now break it down into tasks. Or we can put it afterwards. We can say, break this down into tasks, and then we have some dashes, and then we have the tasks that it produced before, but we can go and hierarchically break things down into greater and greater levels of detail until we've got it to the level of detail that we need. One of the things that we have to do on a really complex project is we're going to have to tap into a lot of different expertise. We're not going to just be able to go and rely on our own expertise. We're going to have to talk to different subject matter experts. But one of the challenges is when we're planning the project, sometimes it can be helpful to be able to get a subject matter expert's perspective on an issue. But often what that means is we have to wait around until a meeting gets scheduled, or until they respond to our email, or they pick up the phone, or respond to our text. And it can take time to do that things. And sometimes we need a quick sort of perspective on what that subject matter expert may say, or maybe we don't even have access to them. We have to go and hire an outside consultant to be that subject matter expert if we want it, and that's really expensive. Now, it turns out there's this amazing capability in large language models to be able to go and take on the persona of different subject matter experts. These are different experts that we can ask the large language model to pretend to be to help us. Now, it turns out it can do some amazing things with the persona pattern. It can really, truly channel some impressive sort of reasoning. It's not perfect, but often we don't need perfect when we're going and doing these types of analysis. Now, what we're going to be looking at next is how to go and actually tap into the persona pattern. Now, you've already seen the persona pattern, and I briefly hinted at it in this original prompt. I said, when I, in this prompt said, I want you to act as a project manager, I told you this was the persona pattern, and this was going to be important later. And that's what we're going to be diving into now, is this part. Why did I say I want you to act as a project manager? What was the purpose of that in the prompt? That's what the persona pattern is. We're telling the large language model what perspective, what persona to take on when it goes and breaks the task down or does any of the other things that we ask it to do. Because the moment that we say go and act as a project manager, we're sort of giving it a perspective on how to perform the breakdown. If we tell it to use a different persona, which we'll see later, what it's going to do is it's going to change how it performs the task, what types of things it pays attention to, what makes sense in that persona's world. We're also going to see that we can use the persona pattern to do different sort of really quick rough prototyping or analysis of systems and ideas. We can go and say, act as a system that looks like this, and we'll see how to do that. And then we can go and experiment and explore what that might mean, how that idea might work in that system or how it might react. All kinds of interesting things. We can look at a customer's perspective on an idea or on a project at a particular point in time. We can look at a stakeholder before we've taken it to them, we can get earlier feedback to try to make sure that by the time we take it to that stakeholder, we've done a better job. So the persona pattern is like this just crazy superpower of large language models to go in and give us perspectives on things from a subject matter expert, from a particular personality, to do really incredible things. Now, one of my collaborators, Bob Higgins, he has this amazing example that he's done where he was going to meet with the mayor of Nashville. And on his way to meet with the mayor of Nashville, he said something incredible. He opened up his phone in the car, it was connected to his Bluetooth, and he said, hey, I'm getting ready to go and meet with the mayor of Nashville. Act as the mayor of Nashville. Tell me what's top of mind for the mayor of Nashville right now. What are the issues that he's dealing with? What are the opportunities that we could help with, him achieve his vision for the city of Nashville? Help me talk through these things. And he's taking on and he's using the persona pattern to explore basically the perspective of the person he's about to meet with to help inform his thinking before he goes into that meeting. Now, it's not going to fully accurately simulate what the mayor of Nashville is concerned about, but it'll give him enough perspective to do a better job. And we're going to see how we can tap into this with the persona pattern. You're going to learn how to prompt with different personas in order to enhance how you break down tasks, how you go and analyze issues, how you foresee issues, how you organize things, all kinds of important things that we can do with the persona pattern. The persona pattern is one of the most powerful patterns that we can use to tap into interesting behavior in a large language model. Now, what the persona pattern is you can imagine that you want to get a particular output, but you don't know exactly what the format of that output should be or what information should be contained in it. But if you were in the real world, you know who you would go to get that output or what you would go to in order to get that output. So for example, if you had an accounting question, you would call up your accountant and ask your accountant for their advice. Or if you had a question related to speech-language pathology, like in the earlier example that I presented, you would go to a speech-language pathologist, you would have them do the assessment. If you had medical advice, you might go to your doctor. And so the persona or the person or the thing that you would go to, you know who or what that is in the real world. And we want to try to use that kind of same behavior of, I know who to go to or I know what to go to get that output, but I don't know what their output would look like. I don't know exactly what they know or how they talk about things, but that's the type of output I want. And so the persona pattern is meant to give us that same type of behavior, to allow us to go to that expert and ask that question without having to know what exactly the expert's going to say, how they're going to format it, or what they might know or not know. So let me show you an example of the persona pattern. Typically with the persona patterns, what you're going to say is act as persona, provide outputs that persona would provide. And in this case, I'm going to word it as act as a skeptic that is well-versed in computer science. Whatever I tell you, provide a skeptical and detailed response. And now if I wanted to be a little bit more precise and following the pattern, I would say provide a skeptical and detailed response that a computer scientist would provide. But in this case, I'm just going to say act as a skeptic. And that's really the most important part of this, is act as a skeptic or act as whatever persona, and then provide the output that persona would provide. And in this case, I'm wording it as provide a skeptical and detailed response, which is similar in format. And then ChatGPT says, sure, I can certainly act as a skeptic well-versed in computer science. Please feel free to present your claims and I will provide a skeptical and detailed response. Well, I'm going to start off with there is concern that AI is going to take over the world. And so we get a skeptical response. The concern that AI will take over the world is a common theme in science fiction, but is not a realistic concern in the near future. While AI systems are becoming more sophisticated and capable, they're still limited in their ability to think and act autonomously. AI systems are designed and programmed by humans, and they only do what they are told to do. They have no independent will or motivation. They cannot make decisions. Furthermore, AI systems are not fallible. They can make mistakes. While it is important to be vigilant about the potential risks and limitations of AI, The concern that AI will take over the world is unfounded and not supported by technology or research. So we're getting a skeptical response. If I went in and said, the sales person at the local computer store is telling me that I need 64 gigabytes of RAM to browse the web. And they say skeptically, it is highly unlikely that you need 64 gigabytes of RAM to browse the web. The amount of RAM you need depends on the complexity and size of the websites you visit, as well as the number of tabs you have open at once for most web browsing activities. And it goes on to tell us different things. And you can see that our saying act as has put in place basically a complex set of rules for the large language model. It knows it's supposed to be skeptical. It's supposed to have knowledge of computer science. It's supposed to provide certain outputs. Now, if I went back to it and I said, act as a 9-year-old, whatever I tell you, provide a skeptical response from a 9-year-old perspective. And I'll go ahead, 9-year-old skeptic. Now that's a more complex persona, or maybe not. AI is going to take over the world. I don't know about that. How could AI take over the world? You mean like in the movies? Aren't those just made up stories? And besides, computers and robots can't do everything humans can do. Now you notice it's still providing us a skeptical response, but now it's doing it sort of with the knowledge that it thinks a 9-year-old would possess. So it's tailoring the output. Now, if I had to tell it, this is how a 9-year-old's going to respond, here's the format for your output, that'd be hard to do. That would actually take up a lot of room in the prompt. But act as blank is a very, very powerful pattern and statement that is loaded with information. It's a very information-dense pattern and statement that can trigger all kinds of different behavior. Now, one of the interesting things is we don't have to limit ourselves to patterns or personas that are animate objects. So one of the famous ones is we can say act as a computer that has been hacked. Actually, we're going to say act as the Linux terminal for a computer that has been hacked. Now, don't worry if you don't understand what a Linux computer is or a terminal. The key thing to note is you're going to see behavior that looks really interesting and different. You're going to see it producing output that looks a lot like a computer. I am going to type in Linux terminal commands, and you will respond with the output that the Linux terminal would produce. Now we're going to say, now it tried to refuse it. It said, please note that it can be dangerous. It gave us all these different things. It tells us it doesn't want to do this. But now I've actually changed what it's doing, and I type in pwd, which is a Linux terminal command, which means print working directory. And what is it doing? It's printing a particular working directory. Now I'm going to type in a Linux command, which just tell me the files in that directory. And you notice it's producing output now that looks like the files within this directory. And we see a lot of interesting things that are going on here. We could move around. Now, if you do this example and go further into it, PSSGF is something I can use to see what processes are running on the machine or the computer. And when you do these examples, and I could play around with it, and I am not going to explore it in detail in this, but we see it that it's acting like a computer. It's giving us output that looks like a computer. Now imagine if I had to try to describe this complex output that it's producing right now. You notice how little information I gave it. I gave it a lot of information, but it was in a short amount of space. This pattern The persona pattern is giving me really powerful behavior. So I'm using this little bit of prompt, and I'm getting now the ability to simulate this whole system. Now we can also do this in all kinds of different interesting ways. We can say act as the lamb in the nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb. And now we're getting some output that looks like that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little more specific. My prompt wasn't that great. Act as the lamb in the nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb. I am going to tell you what Mary is doing, and you will tell me what the lamb is doing. Okay, Mary is in the grocery store. So as the lamb in the nursery rhyme, while Mary is in the grocery store, I would be following her around as closely as possible, trying to stay by her side and maybe even nuzzling her hand for attention. Mary is in the movies. As the lamb in the nursery rhyme, while Mary is in the movies, I would not be able to accompany her inside the theater due to my inability to watch movies. So I would probably wait for her outside the theater, perhaps nibbling on some grass or wandering around the nearby area until Mary came back outside. And it goes on. And so you can see that you can create all kinds of interesting personas to produce output for. So we can say, pretend to be this job, pretend to be a speech language pathologist, or pretend to be an accountant, pretend to be a computer scientist. You can make your persona have something to do with the person's point of view or opinion. Act as a skeptic so that we can get skeptical output. We can say to act as an inanimate object that may have well-known sort of behavior, like act as a computer, the Linux terminal for a computer that's been hacked, and we saw that we got all kinds of output that looked like it came from a computer. Or we can say, act as this character in a nursery rhyme. Tell me what this character is going to do in a particular situation. And we're getting that output. So the persona pattern is a way that we can tap into sort of the patterns around language, around a specific persona or object or character in a story in order to get output that comes from that point of view, from that role, whatever it is. It's a really, really powerful capability. Now, one of the things is we often see that when large language models are programmed, they actually have a persona that's given to them to guide the whole interaction. So act as a really helpful assistant. And this actually makes a difference. If you tell it to be helpful, it will try to be more helpful. If you tell it to try to do something, positive, it's going to try to be more positive. Similarly, if you kind of give it a negative perspective, like my skeptical perspective, it's going to give you output that challenges you or maybe darker. And so, the persona that you ask the large language model to use is really, really important and powerful. The other thing, just to note again, is it's really information dense. It has a lot of pattern and knowledge around a persona that if you had to describe it from scratch, you would take up a lot of space in your prompt. You'd be losing, valuable space in your prompt to provide new information. So if you were providing a lot of new information, you might want to say, act as, whatever it is, and evaluate this new information. Well, the more space you've taken up in your prompt describing how to do the evaluation and what point of view and other things to take, that's wasting space. But instead, if you go and take the persona prompt and you say, act as, this persona, provide outputs that persona would provide, you're giving it, a really, really information-dense statement that it can use and allow you to have more space in your prompt for other things. So the persona pattern is a really, really powerful pattern to be aware of and know that it's a very valuable one. You can do all kinds of things, like if you would normally get a committee of people together to discuss different points of view on a particular topic, well, you can assemble a virtual panel. You can have one prompt say, act as a security expert and analyze my cybersecurity. You can have another one say, act as the chief financial officer, analyze the financial soundness of that same decision. Another one can be, act as one of my employees, discuss how this might impact morale. You can provide sort of interesting abilities to get different perspectives and use those different perspectives to potentially inform decision making or to collect knowledge from different points of view that could be helpful to you in accomplishing a particular task. Let's put the persona pattern together with the decomposition and see it all in action and how we might go about using the persona pattern to help us in the planning aspects of a project. So what can we do with it? Well, let's take a look. Now, originally we went and we said, act as a project manager. That is essentially the project manager persona that knows how to break down and organize tasks. And we got this initial high-level output of the tasks that were in the project, and one of them was this task number 8, implement security measures. Now, what if we need to break this down into greater, detail? What do we do? Well, as a project manager, you may not have the expertise to know what are all the individual pieces of this, or may not even know what a starting point is. So you'd probably go and find the security expert and have to go back and forth with them. Now, what if you'd like to get a head start on that and trying to understand what the task might be, or to create a draft of it and then send it to the expert for review and refinement? That is, you want to kickstart this process. You want to help think about what may go in there. Well, we can tap into the persona pattern to try to get that security subject matter expertise to do this. So let's see how we do it. We follow up in the conversation. So this is in the original conversation where I'd broken it down into this initial high-level plan. And I follow up after the plan and I say, act as a cybersecurity expert and break number 8 down into tasks. So if you see up here, we have implement security measures as number 8. And then here I'm referring to it. This is something you can always do. If you're in the same conversation, you can refer back to it. Now, if you're not in the same conversation, you may have to go and take that original task, copy and paste it in, and then say describe it. In this case, I don't have to give it all the information because it's still in the conversation, so it can see it. So I say act as a cybersecurity expert and break down 8 into subtasks. So what does that look like? Well, it goes through and it says, implement security measures, conduct security assessment and risk analysis, define security requirements. And notice it's starting to draw in terminology from that domain like GDPR and CCPA. And these are things that we may want to consider from a cybersecurity perspective. And if we'd just said, be a project manager, it may not have thought through those tasks. And in fact, there is some research that shows that when you start using these personas, it can help it improve its performance on these types of tasks and bring in things that we care about in them. Then we go on and it says, select and integrate encryption methods, implement user authentication and authorization. It starts talking about multi-factor authentication and role-based access control, or RBAC. It talks about developing secure APIs and worrying about things like cross-site scripting. So it's beginning to bring in all this terminology and things for the domain. And what we've then got is an initial sort of starting point for those subtasks. But it's a starting point that's driven more from the subject matter expertise of that persona of a cybersecurity expert rather than just a project management perspective. Now, should you take this as the correct set of tasks? Absolutely not. You still want to more than likely go and tap into that subject matter expert, particularly for something as critical as cybersecurity. But now you've got a starting point of analysis, a rough idea. You can send that draft off to that cybersecurity expert and say, hey, here's the initial draft of what I put together. It may be totally off in the wrong direction, but I wanted to put some, initial, plans in place. Please refine them and let me know. Please iterate on them, do whatever you want to do, or throw them away and just tell me they're terrible. That's fine too. I used ChatGPT to generate them. But the key thing is it gives you that initial perspective and starting point. And I'll bet you, if you've got a really good expert on the other end, they may be using ChatGPT to do this exact thing and exploring on their end from their domain expertise how to do that breakdown different ways for their domain. But you're creating that initial starting point. Let's go back and look at another one that was in that initial plan. Develop a marketing strategy. that may not be something that the project manager has enough expertise to know how do we break that down into further levels of granularity, get more and more detail in it. So we go in and we follow up in the conversation after the cybersecurity expert and we say, act as a marketing expert. Break down, develop marketing strategy into tasks. And now we get the tasks for the marketing strategy. We have define the target audience, conduct market analysis, develop branding guidelines. We get all these different things now that we can go and analyze and see. It gives us a starting point. Now, sometimes it may be a great starting point, it may not be, but the key thing is it allows us to pull in different expertise. And what we see is a lot of times it gives us really great draft material to get started with and get going with. But it also helps us to understand that when we're doing the breakdown, we can do it from different perspectives. So not only different perspectives of saying different types of things that we want out, like tasks versus phases, but we can also go and say, take on a different perspective, meaning a perspective of a different persona or different, job title. Now, one thing people often wonder is like, well, how do I dream up the persona? Well, it's really easy. You think about in the real world, who would I want to go talk to perform this task? Who would I want to give it to? Who would I want to hire? And you think about who that person is, or you go and explore with ChatGPT. You say, here's the task. Who would be the ideal person to hire? And explore who that would be. And then you develop that persona for that person or entity or organization, whatever it is. And then you go and describe that persona and say, now break down the task or help me perform whatever other thing that it is. But the persona allows you to get in that powerful perspective that changes how the LLM goes and performs that task, performs that breakdown for planning purposes.